Just changing. Perfect. Welcome to Do It in Durham. This is Durham Celebration of Entrepreneurship, and it is held each November during Global Entrepreneurship Week. Do It in Durham Entrepreneurship Week is a collaboration of Durham's business support, educational, and networking organizations who have come together to encourage and support entrepreneurs, job creators, and innovators, you, who create economic growth in Durham Region. If you're looking to start a business, invest in a business, grow a business, we encourage you to do it in Durham, the Durham region. We could not do this without our amazing sponsors. Without their support and contribution, we could not host this week. We could not offer so much information and just showcasing the ecosystem that's here to support business owners and entrepreneurs. So thank you to our premier sponsors. Thank you to our partner sponsors. Thank you so much to our community sponsors. Feel free to share your experiences and to help raise awareness and visibility that you are open for business and that the Durham region has a thriving business community. I'm going to put in the chat box some hashtags to use, but I encourage you, there's about 3 I'll encourage you to use right now. It's Do It in Durham 2024. And GEW, which stands for Global Entrepreneurship Week Canada, or GEW 2024, because what they will do is they'll start looking for those hashtags and Durham Region gets put on a map, which is exciting. Subscribe to the BACD YouTube channel to receive a notification when videos like this one are uploaded and to check out the ones already there. So I'll also put in the YouTube channel link. My name is Patrice Esper. I'm a business advisor and program coordinator at the BACD. I'll be facilitating this session and monitoring the chat box. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat box, share who you are or about your business, and remember to add your contact details or website so that people can search you when this presentation is over, because we're going to give due attention to Amanda. And then you can save the chat so you can access those details later. When we finish, I'll open up the opportunity to show, to ask questions meaning turn your cameras on if you like, but for more engaging experience, we always encourage that. So now I hand over to Amanda. It looks like we have quite a large group of people who wanted podcasts or are interested in podcast, learning more about podcasting. So Amanda, all yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Patrice. That was perfect. And hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you today to talk about strategic podcasting for business owners. And so I'm going to give a little backgrounder on me before we get started. So my background is in radio. I used to work as a producer, reporter, news anchor, mainly at Toronto talk radio stations. But I've also had a long history with podcasting. I made my first podcast in 2010, long before they were popular like they are today. I wrote the first edition of my book, Let's Talk Podcasting, The Essential Guide to Doing It Right, in 2018. This book ended up getting used in multiple post-secondary education institutions. I was brought in to also update a lot of radio programs to include podcasting. And in 2020, I launched my business, Lead Podcasting. So we are a podcast production company that makes podcasts for thought leaders and enterprise organizations. So a longtime audio lover, and I've had lots of anecdotal experience in this space, which I'll draw upon as we continue on in this presentation. But I would love to just hear from you. So if you could pop into the chat, curious where you're at, whether you're a beginner and just learning about podcasting, maybe listening for the first time. If you're intermediate, you love podcasts and have listened a lot, or if you're advanced, you actually already have your own show and you're just looking to learn more. Beginner, new, intermediate, big time listener, or advanced, you actually started your own. I see some beginners. Ooh, a writer. Cool. That's great. But no experience in podcasting. That's okay. There's lots of overlap there. We have Ezza, who's advanced. Okay, great. If you're advanced and you have your link to your show, happy to have you pop that into the chat too. And we have some people who are beginner and starting to listen to some. That's great. Cheryl's a beginner too, not alone. This is really, really good. So no matter where you are on the spectrum, you are going to definitely take something away from this session. So no worries. There'll be lots of insights and hopefully able to meet you where you're at. So let's continue on and just talk, like, let's level set. I like to just talk about the brief history of how we got here. So, podcast as we know it started in 2004, which means it's the 20-year anniversary of podcasting. And as we know it, meaning sharing audio for streaming or downloading through an RSS feed. So that is what the definition originally was. And in 2005, the word podcast was actually the word of the year. The word podcast comes from iPod and broadcast. So Apple was a big player in the early days. And it really, there was a lot of popularity, experimentation, but then it kind of tapered off up until 2014. That's where things changed. Two big things happened this year. The first one was that this icon, as you'll see, was put on its own button on a purple background on all iOS devices by Apple. So previously, podcasts were found within iTunes within a separate tab called podcasts. And it was kind of buried underneath music. When Apple decided to give it its own app, the Apple Podcast Player, people were experimenting, clicking it, big deal. That year was also a big year because Serial launched. This show is really popular. It was really, really popular. It broke all sorts of records. It still holds a lot of these records. It won a Peabody Award. It was about a man who was convicted of a murder who maintained his innocence, and he had been in jail for 10 years. And a lot of research showed if people had maintained their innocence for that long, that they likely were innocent. And so they reopened this case, and long story short, he's free now. It's not just because of the podcast, but there definitely was this like public uprising around this case. So very, very interesting. And that both of these things happening in 2014 shot up a second wave. People refer to it as the serial effect. Lots of new listeners, lots of people getting engaged with the medium. It's been growing steadily since 2014, year over year. In 2019, we did see this huge acquisition frenzy. This is when Apple kind of lost themselves in being the front runner. In 2019, other big tech companies wanted to have a stake in the game. So we had Spotify allowing for podcasts to be used on their music player. They started buying up companies and shows. Amazon also trying to make their name in the whole podcast space. They bought up a very big production company called Wondery. So lots of acquisitions happening, lots of software shows being bought. Now we're in this iteration and regulation phase where like some of those big purchases, some of them worked out, some didn't. So they're kind of right sizing. And then also there's a lack of regulation because we're realizing that audio for the most part was handled through radio broadcast channels, and licensing and rules tended to be nationally run. But podcasting is international. So who is the international audio licensor? Like it doesn't really exist. So it is a little bit tough to get mainstream music to be able to be played on a podcast because there's no one who really owns the rights to the song internationally. It's all nationally run. So lots of room for growth, and the industry is definitely, although 20 years old, has a long ways to go with regard to that in that sense. So it definitely is exciting. By the numbers, there are, if you Google how many podcasts are out there, you're going to see the number 5 million or more than 5 million come up. I will tell you that that's not a real number. It's impossible to know how many because we don't even know how to define podcast. If you upload it on YouTube and it's two people chatting, is that a podcast? Does that count? What if you upload one audio podcast, one, and then in 10 years you don't upload another one? Is that still a podcast? Inactive? Also, when you upload on Spotify and Apple, some are on both, some are only on one, but they're not sharing data, so you can't cross-reference. So it's very hard to actually know how many are out there. But all we know for sure is that there's a lot of growth happening, and we know how many people are listening because that is data that is more tangible. So we know that there are nearly 12 million adults in Canada that listen monthly. We also know that ad revenue in the US is set to be $4 billion this year, which is money's being made. Quite, it's quite the number. And this is an international trend. This is not just in Canada and the US. Chile is seeing the largest growth in new monthly listeners. And actually, if you look at the map, you'll see there's a lot of hotspots popping up all over the place. And it's actually very interesting. It's different in every country as to like why podcasting is booming with popularity and what kind of shows are most popular. I think it's important to recognize that there's podcasts beyond English speaking markets. So across Europe, very popular. In South America, we see a lot of Spanish podcasts, especially tied to telenovelas. So they'll take telenovela stories and turn them into podcasts. Lots of following that just transfers over. In South Korea, even, we've seen a big pop, and mainly that's because of the political satire podcasts that are being made there. So different reasons for different areas, and I just find it very interesting how it's kind of taking the world by storm. Best practices when making your own podcast. So these are the 4 key best practices. Number 1 is authenticity, just being yourself, using your voice. Don't feel like you have to have this like big booming radio voice. We're seeing a lot of the most popular podcasts are just average people like me and you. And that's what's great about it. It really democratizes the medium. Having a sustainable schedule is very important. So this is releasing at a cadence that is regular, that audiences can remember and expect. So if you're releasing once a week, committing to releasing at that cadence doesn't mean you have to release forever. You could take a break, call it season 1, and then move to another season, but you should be releasing weekly as your season is being uploaded. We do see that there's no magic frequency. Weekly definitely aligns with people's weekly routines, but there's no right or wrong. If you already have a newsletter that's going out every month and you want to capitalize on that, then why not? You could do monthly and attach it to your newsletter. Leaning into a niche, also very important. So, we know that we don't know how many podcasts, but we know there's a lot, and you want to cut through the noise, right? So how do you do that? Don't be afraid to get too niche. Even if you were to do a podcast about what it's like in Canada or in Durham, having something that serves those audiences can really set you apart instead of trying to be everything to everyone. We just got someone sharing in the chat that when they check their analytics, Germany is where they get the 3rd most listeners after US and Canada. Always wondered why. See, you never know. It could just be that your topic was being highly searched in that area, and then it was being served up within the podcast players. It could also be that word of mouth, like one person shared it with a family member or friend in Germany, and then they've been spreading it, right? I have recently a podcast that has been popping up in Botswana. I know no one in Botswana, so that's, who knows? But it's really great because it really does break down the borders and to the medium. So it's a borderless way to tell stories. And then lastly, another best practice is being intentional with your format. And so what do I mean by format? What is a podcast format? This is actually one of the most skipped over steps when developing a podcast, is like taking the time to think about the format. And when I talk about format, I'm talking about like how the story is being presented, how the episode comes together. And so I've bucketed it into 4 different formats. So we're going to take a listen to some so you can wrap your head around this. But the first one is called a one-person show. So this is a format where it's just like one person talking. It maybe a comedian. Think of a comedian who does like a stand-up act. It's just them. And actually comedians are the ones who very much popularized this as a format. And so I do think that the one-person show is sometimes overlooked, but can be quite powerful. Just looking into the chat again and seeing Instagram interviews reach global countries, which led to a class in Nigeria. That's so great. I love that. Connecting communities around the world through audio storytelling. That's actually the mission of my company. And there it is, like living it out right there. The second podcast format is Chatcast. This is the one that most people know. And this is the one that most people default to when they're making a show. But it's not always the best way depending on your content. So the Chatcast is 2 people in conversation, maybe a fireside chat. Maybe it's like a round table with multiple voices. But That would be more of a chat cast. And then we have narrative. So narrative is slickly produced with a journalistic script and clips. So if you think about maybe documentary style shows or news reports that would have like, an interview that was done, they just take the best parts and then they're weaving it together. And then the host or the journalist is the one who's like telling the story and connecting all the dots. So that's referred to as narrative in the industry. And then we have scripted, which is, all of these could have a script, but when you're in the industry, if someone says scripted, they're referring to fictional podcasts. So these are like voice actors, sound effects, and it's a fictional story. That is what is being referred to when you hear the word scripted podcast. So these are 4 different formats, and we're going to take a listen to some examples in just a moment. But first, I want to pause and see if you have any questions, and I'll also take a look at the chat just so I can make sure I see everybody here. All right, we actually do already have some here because I know I just threw a lot of information at you. Okay, so can you podcast from anywhere in the world? Are you restricted to broadcast only from your country? No, it's like you could, once you put it up on Apple, it's available everywhere. The only thing that might get restricted is based on podcast player. Like some countries don't really use Apple Podcasts, but you could have your podcast be global for sure. And then yes, Rod, you were answering that, so that's great. And what inspired me to begin? Love your vibe. Oh, thanks. I always loved audio. I was in radio, but I was discovering podcasts. One of the first podcasts I listened to was called 99% Invisible. Some of you might know this show. I highly recommend it. It's about design, and I was listening to an episode about how barcodes were invented, and I just thought this is so neat. I'm learning about this. I'm like able to be in the car and just like in my own little world. And yeah, it was quite inspiring. And I just thought I would love to make something like this. Yes, exactly. It's the one with NPR. That's correct. So I've come to love so many stories. And so I definitely listen professionally, but I also listen personally because I just really enjoy audio stories. And I think there's a really intimacy to the medium, which is quite special. And as someone who worked in radio too, I know that like doing interviews with someone without the camera tends to get a better interview out of them. And so when they have these audio only stories, I do think there's like a little magic to it that nothing else can really compare to. So, any other questions? Oh, the best episodes when they discovered that the percentage of their name was breaking the podcast software. I haven't heard that episode. I'm gonna have to look that up. That sounds neat though. See, and really leaning into themselves, like their own reality, which is very authentic of them, aligning with some good best practices. Okay, we're gonna continue on. I'll stop periodically for questions like this, but we'll also have time at the end to go through. So don't worry if you don't get a chance to think of it just yet. So here are some podcasts that I have worked on or my company has produced. And so some of these are perhaps podcasts that you recognize. Stress Test has been very popular from the Globe and Mail. So if you're into personal finance, you might have heard this one. But there's definitely ones I'm sure you haven't heard of. For instance, the Sleeman Breweries podcast, which didn't even have podcast artwork because it was a private podcast. We made this podcast to be shared internally within Sleeman, the company, the brewery, to engage employees and bring people together. And so podcasting is very unique in that there's different kinds of podcasts that you might not even know exist. Podcasting is being used as a form of internal communications, and that's like a big trend we're seeing to reach employees. Another internal podcast that I wanted to highlight was the Learning Lounge, which was done for the region of Durham. And so Lead Podcasting teamed up with Durham Region to put together an episode of the Learning Lounge, which was used as a professional development tool internally. Yeah, thank you. And so it's very neat to see how these kinds of podcasts are reaching people. But there's also, what I like to say is whether or not you're external or internal, and whether or not you're hitting number one on Apple, there's a lot of different success metrics that you should take into account. And I think sometimes we kind of get caught up in the Apple ranking. And like I said, Apple is not even the number one globally used podcast platform. That's very much an English speaking audience and very developed country thing. So it's not actually the best representation of success. And so What I like to talk about is how some of these podcasts had different goals. And I'm going to talk about some of the different goals you could have for a podcast. And you think of it in your own company too. Like if you were to start a podcast, what would your goal be? What would be the best thing for your business? So here are some examples of goals that are not just number one on Apple. So of course the first one, audience growth, yes. The most amount of listeners, sure. You could have that as a goal. And that's nice to track no matter what, but it really shouldn't be the be all and end all. The next one is a product or a service sale. So at the end of every podcast episode, people are expecting a call to action. It's like baked into the fiber of what podcasts have been doing. So it's not odd to put that there. And so having a promo code so you can track who heard the podcast and use that promo code, or creating a website URL that's specifically for podcast listeners, like slash your website slash podcast, and checking traffic to that URL. These can be some metrics that you then benchmark against yourself. Like maybe you compare your product sale promo codes compared to Facebook ads that have a different promo code and see which one does better, right? And then you can decide if the podcast is accomplishing that goal or not. Another one is increasing trust in you as a leader. So building your leadership profile. We know that writing a book has been a huge clout, a way to establish clout as an entrepreneur or as a thought leader. And now we're seeing that podcasting is also very comparable. So you'll see people say that they're a podcast host on LinkedIn, and maybe that's your goal. You just want to add that to your title. And then it doesn't matter how many listeners you get. If you're hosting a show, you're hosting a show. And there is a amount of respect and trust that automatically is attached to having your own podcast. It's just how people have been associating with the medium, which is quite special and great to capitalize on. There's also brand affinity, and we're going to listen to that, an example of a podcast that was purely made for brand affinity. So just having more positive association with a brand, and maybe not a leader. Maybe you don't want to be on maybe you don't want to be on the podcast, right? You're like, I actually don't want to host it, but I want my brand to be lifted through a show. We're going to listen to an example of how you might be able to do that, but creating really engaging, thoughtful content can really help up the respect and trust that you get with your brand. Strengthening partnerships. Some shows, truly, they don't even care how many listeners they have. They're using it as an excuse to talk to people they want to talk to. And so if you were to cold email someone who's either a respected peer or a potential client, they might not answer you. But if you email them saying, hey, we're inviting you on to be a guest on my podcast, you have a much better chance of getting a response. And so sometimes I've had clients use their podcast just as a way to get a client call, really, have a thoughtful conversation, bond, and convert that guest into a client, which is really neat. And again, it's like putting aside the numbers of how many listeners and really using it as a relationship building tool and turning a cold lead into a warm one. Very exciting to see that happen. Another example, search engine optimization, SEO. So podcasts are keyword rich by nature. You're talking about what you love. And writing blog content can sometimes be tough, but speaking about what you love can maybe be a bit easier. And so I've worked with a thought leader who is launching a website, didn't want to write a bunch of blogs. We sat in a room, I pressed record. He talked at me and told me all of the stuff that's floating around in his head. And we chunked it up into 5 episodes, transcribed it, hyperlinked everything. And that was his blog content. And he had the audio there then, so infused with his voice so people could have him speak it out too. But it wasn't even meant to get a bunch of listeners. He didn't even put it on Apple. He just put it on his website and tried to drive traffic to his website. So very interesting use cases that sometimes people don't think of. We got to get caught up in those more traditional metrics. So now we're going to take a little moment to listen to some of these examples, which I think will help bring it to life. So I'm just going to have to share the tab accordingly. So we're just going to share that. Here we go. So the first one we're listening to is called Scale Conscious. And so, oh shoot, I think I did the wrong one again. Okay, one sec. Just put a thumbs up if you can hear this.
Welcome.
No. Okay. Wait.
Welcome to Scale Conscious, a journey for fearless.
You can. Okay. Great. Thank you. So this is the gal that I worked with who used this purely for relationship building. Okay. She made this show. She did 5 episodes, season 1, not a heavy lift, invited 5 key people that she wanted to rub shoulders with, and actually did end up converting one of them to being a client. Brilliant. So let's take a listen. This is the trailer of her show. The trailer mimics the format of a one-person show. So it's just her talking. And the trailer's meant to be like a movie trailer, just to set you up for the series. So let's take a listen.
Welcome to Scale Conscious, a journey for fearless founders building brave brands for a better world. I'm Angela Wallace. I go by Ange. I'm a trained conscious capitalist, and I've been a brand champion for nearly a decade. As we continue to navigate a challenging pandemic, supply chain issues, and never-ending cost increases, leaders are under more pressure than ever to figure out how to prosper with purpose. We've witnessed some cautionary tales and seen some of the pitfalls that come up in mission-minded leadership. So, what are some strategies for startups to build better businesses and sell with soul? I'm inviting some of the most visionary folks I know to help me answer that question in my first podcast series. Together, we'll explore how to create conscious companies with compassion, conviction, and courage, and share how we can redefine a regenerative future for all. So go ahead and subscribe to Scale Conscious wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Okay, so there it is. A great, just level set, kind of high level look at what her show's all about. And creating a trailer like this really helps with outreach too. You could create the trailer and send it to potential guests to say, hey, I have a show. It hasn't launched yet, but here's what the trailer sounds like. It just adds another layer of professionalism to your show, to your outreach efforts. And then also when you have a trailer, you can get audiences excited. So you could share it, you would publish it on Apple and wherever you want to distribute it, and then share that link so that people start following the show even before episode 1 drops. So then once episode 1 comes out, you actually already have a listener base. So it's actually great as an audience growth tactic as well. So that's that one person example and the example of relationship building. The second example we're going to listen to is called Lead Balloon. And this is out of the US, but I like to use it as an example because it's my own industry. And so it's funny, like lead podcasting does not have its own podcast. We're so busy producing, and it's like, the shoemaker's child doesn't have good shoes or whatever. Yes, it's that. Like, we don't have our own podcast, but we know it works because our clients are seeing success. PodCamp Media. This is the other podcast production company. Dusty owns it. I know him well. He's brilliant. And so we were just kind of sharing insights on how we get clients. And he was saying he gets most of his clients from his podcast, which is brilliant and makes sense. So he's targeting the head of marketing, the head of PR, the head of comms, communications. And what he does is interview those folks about their worst PR moments and how they handled them. And the production of his podcast is so good. They come on, they hear that, and then they tend to want to work with him. So anyway, let's take a listen to this trailer. And this is done in the format of a narrative format.
It was like a slow motion car accident. And I was like saying to myself, oh no, this isn't happening.
In the fields of PR and marketing, we all have those stories. Old war stories, nightmare scenarios, oh crap moments, whatever you call them, they're the kinds of stories that we tell over and over again at happy hours, office parties, and conferences. And on the Lead Balloon podcast, we recreate these stories from some of the world's biggest brands and institutions by talking to the comms executives, creative directors, and project managers who were there. Stories like, why did Mike Dukakis end up in that tank for that ridiculous photo op?
The National Press Corps and everyone on the press riser bends over guffawing. What a ridiculous stunt that this was.
Why did Wendy's social media manager quit her job 2 months after she became the most famous account on brand Twitter?
It's so easy to lose that humanity and be like, well, you're stupid, and it's not productive, and it doesn't feel good.
And what does it take to work as Coca-Cola's VP of Global Communications?
Let me just tell you, it's going to take a lot more than one person to bring down the Coca-Cola company.
And Lead Balloon has been nominated for a Webby Award and recognized as Marketing Podcast of the Year by Adweek. So find Lead Balloon on your favorite podcast app and subscribe for PR and marketing disaster stories told by the well-meaning communications professionals who live them. Or visit podcampmedia.com/leadballoon for more info.
There you go. So you get to hear how he wove those clips together. He pulled the best parts of those interviews. I mean, this is a more complex edit, but narrative and journalistic in its approach, and has been really speaking to a very specific target audience, which is his clients. The last one we're going to listen to is an example of a scripted podcast. So this is a fictional podcast. And what was their goal? Brand affinity. I talked about potentially looking at one that has brand affinity as its goal. This is it. So this is done by General Electric, but you're not hearing from the CEO of General Electric. You're not hearing from anyone in that industry. They've just made a podcast about aliens and but they have to use really high-tech technology to decode a message. And so that's where the brand affinity, it's just like a very loose connection, but it's presented by General Electric. And so really you just love the podcast and then by proxy end up having warm feelings towards General Electric. So let's take a listen to the trailer of this show.
Hi, Nikki Tomlin here, and I'm the host of The Message. I'm going to take you into an elite cryptography think tank and check it out. Their top project right now is to decode a highly classified radio transmission from the 1940s.
Have you listened to it yet?
Not yet. We're having a discussion about that. But if I offered you the chance to listen to it right now... sounds like a no.
Well, we don't really know what it is. Voices, music, breathing. But you know, I'm not going to mess with that thing.
To sum it up, extraterrestrials. Subscribe to The Message on iTunes.
Okay, so a little creepy, really great music scoring on this one. And you'll hear, right? They made it sound like the guy was on the phone. I mean, that was just fake. Like he was done in studio and they applied filters on that to really set a scene. So this is where, and Nikki Tomlin is not a real person. She's a character, right? So it's very interesting how they use the medium in a really creative way and still to help with their business growth. So I'm just going to go back and actually take a moment now to take some questions. Great storytelling and styles. I agree, right? It's so inspiring to see how creative people can get with this. We had a question from Andrea. What kind of content did Sleeman share? Yeah, great question. So with the internal podcast, they have different goals. Sleeman in particular actually was bought by Sapporo, an Asian beer brand. And so what they were trying to do is actually bring the teams together and create some unity around this acquisition. And so that's like one big factor for some of these internal podcasts is like the merging of teams. So they had the head of the Sapporo on being interviewed with by a Sleeman employee, right? To kind of bridge those verticals to show like we're all one now. We've also done some internal podcasts where the goal was for employee engagement. And so if there was a really great win that happened, managers can nominate people on their team to get on the podcast, share what they were able to accomplish, share what they did, share best practices within the company. So it's really nice to be having that as a way to lift employee voices and success stories within an organization as well. So some very interesting use cases for the internal podcasting. And if you are curious to learn more about internal podcasting, I'll see if I could grab the link, but you could definitely just Google my name and internal podcasting. And I just recently wrote a whole article for the Globe and Mail about this. So you should be able to access that. What approach would you suggest if we're accustomed to doing the lives? Yeah, we should use those, continue with those until we're waiting to invest. Yeah, so I think the lives are good, but sometimes it's like pros and cons, right? So I would say you could either take the lives, and if you have someone who knows how to edit, what I love is like people don't really love to watch an entire live from start to finish, but if you actually just took the best parts of the live and maybe even put a little narration, thoughtful narration to honor the fact that someone's watching it after. Take out maybe some live glitches. You could download that audio and like treat it a little bit and share it as a podcast. That could be a step one. Or yeah, get feedback about the lives. Like I love letting employees speak and say, how do you like the lives? Would you prefer this as a podcast that you could listen to at your own time, right? And try to see what is preferred, and maybe you do end up choosing the one that whatever is like voted for the most, right? Because I know it can be a bit of a heavy on resources when you're doing too much. Okay, someone just talked about Descript. You're jumping ahead. You're right though. I'm going to recommend that. So let me just finish up with the last bit of the presentation, and then we will open up for final Q&A. So now I'm really getting into how to do it yourself. So here we go, back into my slideshow. So making it happen. Here are the steps. Ultimately, these are the steps you need to take. Step one, define your goal and audience. All right. Who are you talking to, and what is that goal, that ultimate goal you want to hit? This is going to dictate how you approach making your show. Step two is show development. When I say show development, you're developing the format, the artwork, the name of the show, the tagline, all these creative elements. Step three, episode mapping. Commit to a certain number of episodes. You know what? I'm going to do 5. Just pick a number that feels realistic. And then say, like, what do I want to talk about over these episodes? What guests do I want to have? Really try to dig in and have a roadmap, so you're not just like on a hamster wheel. You kind of want a high level view of the whole thing, so you don't get caught in the weeds. Or if you find one episode's giving you a lot of friction, you could actually move on to another one and come back to it, right? You're not like married to this one episode that you're on right now. Step 4 is the recording and editing. That's the literal production of it. And step 5 is distribution and promotion. So that's uploading it to your hosting site and getting it out in the world. We'll talk a little bit about what that takes. Here are some tools for beginners that I love to recommend. These are also linked on leadpodcasting.com/resources. So you can find those links and these pictures there too. This mic, Mayono AU-A04, it's the bad boy I'm using right now. It comes with the arm, the pop filter, everything you see here. It's like $70. It goes on sale a lot. It's very affordable considering what you're getting. It's the best bang for your buck that I've seen. And it's a USB. It just plugs into your computer. And even if you just use this for all your meetings too, like you'll just sound better, right? Like I think you could probably tell I sound pretty good. Headphones, highly recommend headphones. Wired headphones. Okay. So the Sony MDRs are the ones that I used in radio. They are like the standard radio classic go-tos that are still used and still in radio studios to this day. They're about $150. They are middle of the road. You can definitely get headphones for about $50, $25, and you can also get ones for $500, as I'm sure you know. So these ones are the ones I like to recommend. They are wired though, and this is my big thing: is don't get Bluetooth headphones. They're not even letting you hear the sound exactly how it's actually gonna be. So I'd even rather you use like a plug-in wired ones like this over a Bluetooth. Highly recommend the wired headphones, and that would be for you. And if you are going to have a guest, I would ask them to put headphones on too. It just will sound better. You less chance of getting feedback and more accurate sound when you're listening back to it too. Zencaster is what Lead Podcasting uses to record all of our remote interviews. So this is a program that you would pay monthly for, and it is really good. Just sounds like studio quality even though you're remote. Very user friendly, and it's also what Canada Land uses, if we have any Canada Land fans in here. So definitely become an industry standard, especially here in Canada. Descript, here it is. Someone popped that into the chat already. So this is great for beginners because it allows you to generate a transcript based on your audio, and then you can actually edit the transcript, and it makes those same edits to the audio. So you don't actually need to have a full masterclass on audio editing if you're beginning. If you want to go down that route, of course you can. There's lots of YouTube tutorials and classes sometimes at local libraries. But if you want to just get started and test it out, and again, you would have to pay for this, but it does really make it quite accessible if you are wanting to make some edits to your show. And then lastly, distribution. So how do you actually get it all out there? So this is sometimes a misconception. You're not actually uploading to Apple. You're uploading to a hosting site, and then you're distributing the audio from your hosting site to the podcast players. So it's kind of a two-step process. So step one, literally uploading it. Where is that audio living? And then step two is syncing it and distributing it to the podcast players. So it's free to distribute to the podcast players. What costs money sometimes is the uploading, like hosting that audio online. So Acast is one place you could use to host your audio online. They let you do 5 episodes for free. Spotify has recently come up, so they're kind of both. They have a podcast hosting element and then the listening player. So they're actually in both sides. Podcasting for creators, or sorry, Spotify for creators is the name of Spotify's hosting site. So if you Google that, Spotify for creators, you'll see, and you can actually do it for free. And then it automatically syncs with Spotify. You would still have to take that extra step to distribute to other places like Apple and YouTube. Spotify has also announced that they are taking video podcasts now as well, which is a big deal. So you would be generating an RSS feed link. It just looks like a URL, like link kind of, but there's just an RSS code in it. And that's what you would be submitting to all the podcast players that you might want to submit it to. There's other ones. These are mainstream ones, but there's like Castbox and Deezer and a bunch of others. YouTube is also making a big play for the podcast space. So you can upload your podcast to Spotify and sync it with YouTube now. You can distribute it to YouTube, or the other way around. You can upload it to YouTube and have YouTube actually create that RSS feed. But the YouTube developments are a bit new. They're just rolling them out for podcasters. So there's a lot changing by the day, it seems. And so if you don't have a video podcast just yet, then starting with just audio might be easier for you. So, okay. Now, last thing I'll share before I take questions, just a big thank you. It's been so fun chatting, podcasting with you. I love this stuff. I do have that second edition of my book that just came out last week. So if you are interested in getting it and learning more, it gives a deeper history of podcasting, more in-depth on the how-to, a look ahead to the future, and then a behind-the-scenes section on how I made some podcasts and had some success. You could get $5 off if you order it today. So if you scan that QR code and you use the code NOV22, that's today's date, you will get $5 off and can make a great gift for any creators in your life as well. So thank you. I'll pause now, and we have about 15 minutes for questions, which is perfect. So I'm going to look at the chat, but also feel free, we could put our hands up and have some people unmute as well.
That was excellent, Amanda. I'm just going to use this opportunity to sort of wrap up this section. For our viewers on YouTube, now they know more about you and how they can reach you. They also know more about the Business Advisory Centre of Durham and the ecosystem within the Durham region that supports and guides and encourages entrepreneurs, you out there. So thanks so much to everybody who's joined us today, and to our listeners, thanks for listening. Feel free to reach out if you need more help or support. Thank you again, Amanda.
Thank you.